So we are here talking about assessment again, or maybe I should say still. We're still here talking about assessment. Assessment is one of those things in our sector that we seem to get wrong a lot, which is a little bit worrying, seeing it's our core business. And the pattern of what we get wrong with assessment hasn't really changed over the years either. So having a clear understanding of that is important for us, and hopefully we might clarify a few little things today as we look at this publication. So our whole purpose is to work our way through this publication. So the coloured books that we used to know and love, all of our coloured books have been amalgamated into this one publication. And what we've done is we've gone through a process of saying, let's look at this rather than as discrete elements, to look at it as a logical flow of how we might actually deal with this information, with the hope that it makes more sense to you in that way. So for those who were in the previous session, we talked about context being really important, and as we talk about assessment and what's in this publication, we also have to talk about the context within which we are looking at this publication. And of course, our context has changed and continues to change in the vet sector. So just a few of the little changes that we have had recently is that we're now implementing streamlined training packages, and at the last meeting they endorsed something like 32 new training packages in the new streamlined format. So a lot of you are probably dealing with at least one and possibly many more training packages that are in that new format. And of course they have far more specific requirements in there around assessment. In the assessment requirement documents, there's all kinds of little things through there that you have to watch out for. We have the standards for RTOs that were actually released more than a year ago now, but we are still coming to terms with those standards and what they mean and how they'll be implemented, and both the regulators are still doing that. And they're putting out fact sheets and general directions as they figure out how they want to deal with that. We have the strengthened AQF. 2013 was the last change there, but some people aren't aware of that. And of course we have that baseline qualification that underpins what we do as trainers and assessors, and we've just had a release of the new certificate for the TAE 16 qualification. And again, there's a lot of changes in there in terms of what we might need to do, and still some decisions to be made around how that will be implemented within our sector. So the whole governance framework really around how we operate and how we conduct assessment is changing. So while our core concept of assessment hasn't changed, the rules that sit around it have. Now, this publication is current as of May last year. Okay. So there are going to be things in here, for example, there are still parts in here where we talk about the industry skills councils, which of course don't exist anymore. So this information is something, and it actually does, one of the things it says in here is that you need to keep up to date with what's going on in the sector. It's just an impossibility for us to actually make everything absolutely up to date and keep it that way. So this is an online publication. Of course we will be able to update things a little more easily in that sense, but there's I guess an obligation on your part as a professional in the field to just keep up to date with the things that are changing and to think about those things accordingly. So irrespective of what all of that regulation governance frameworks say, there are really 5 things that we look at when we look at assessment, what we would call the 5 pillars of assessment. And I need to thank my colleague Russell Docking for this, because this is his terminology. So when we look at assessment and how it's happening, we look at and make sure that we address the requirements of our training package. They are the things that we're saying, yes, someone is competent in. So those units of competency that sit in those training packages and the rules that sit around its implementation, they're things that we are always looking for. Then we have a look at the way you make your judgment about competence, and we look at the rules of evidence. So every piece of evidence that you use to make a judgment of competence, we apply these 4 rules of evidence to. And when you're looking at your own assessment practice, you should be making sure that that's the case as well. Is the evidence that I'm using to make a judgment, does it actually meet the rules of evidence? We look at the way that you conduct assessment, and that's what the principles of assessment are about. We're asking, do you put a quality assessment process in place? And we use those 4 principles of assessment to help us make a judgment about whether that's what you're doing. We look at that product that you push out, that competent person, and we go back to the workplace and we say, this widget, this person that we've pushed out, can they do the things that you want them to do? Are they competent in the workplace? Can they do the jobs as you expect them to do? And then we have a look at the way you validate, because that's the process that looks at both quality control and quality review of your whole assessment system. So those 5 things are the 5 things that we're always looking at when we're trying to decide whether you put a quality assessment process in place. And they're the things that underpin everything that we've written in this book. Okay? Make sense? Good. So we only have an hour. So obviously we can't go too much in depth into what is in the book, but what I'd like to do is to have a look at each of the sections of that book and address some of the key concepts that are being talked about and provide you with an opportunity to ask any questions. Now, there's a lot of people in the room, so obviously we're not going to be able to answer everybody's questions, but some key questions around each of these sections. So that list that you see there is actually the chapters that sit in that book. So we've started with how much you develop a strategy for learning and assessment. Then we've looked at how would you design assessment tools to address what you put in the strategy. As you're thinking about designing, is there an opportunity for you to cluster any units together? And you might cluster for learning or assessment or both. How much you adjust your assessment practices to meet the needs of individuals. How do you conduct RPL? We've talked a little bit about the assessor competencies, and of course there's a little bit more specification sitting around assessor competencies in the regulation. Okay, assessment strategy. So, you know, this is a really high non-compliance that we have in our sector, these strategies. The people who were in the session beforehand will have heard me use the term vanilla, and this is another situation where we often get vanilla strategies. So this is supposed to be the blueprint for how you're going to implement a qualification for a client group. And if we want to use an analogy and we follow the blueprint line, you know, if I was asking you to build me a house and I said to you, build me a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, full stop. That's the level of detail that we get in a lot of the strategy documents. So the reality is I give that instruction to each of you, you're going to build exactly what you want, not necessarily what I want. So that document should tell you, yes, build me a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house. Use these materials, make the rooms these sizes, paint the walls these colours. Put this kind of roof line on it. There's a lot that sits behind that big picture. That's what your strategy should do. As a trainer and assessor, I should be able to pick up that document and I should know what to do to implement the strategy the way you want it implemented. Now, if that detail is not in the strategy document, then the strategy document should point me to where it is. So maybe you have a whole series of documents that do have all that detail in it. Tell me to go and look at them. Tell me where they are. Don't just leave it as this generic thing. And to be perfectly honest, most strategies I read, the only information I really get from it is what units you've picked. That's it. Everything else is generic. And so then you make my job a lot harder because I have to ask you a million questions to actually figure out what you're doing. So that strategy should be the blueprint for how your people are going to implement the qualification for your client group. And it might be that you have different strategies for the same qualification because you're doing it very differently for different client groups. So what that book does is it goes through a process of outlining the things that you might like to consider and the kinds of questions that you might like to ask yourself as you're thinking about how to actually develop a strategy document. Once we have our strategy in place, we then start to think about our assessment tools. So how are we actually going to assess these units that we have delivered to our clients? And when we're talking about assessment, what we're talking about is two processes. We're talking about a process of collecting evidence, and we're talking about a process of making a judgment about whether somebody's competent or not. So we have to make sure in that process that we unpack our units of competency properly, because fundamentally if we don't do that, well, we haven't got any chance of getting the rest of it right. So when we have a look at your assessment tools in audit processes, we often find that when you have a look at the assessment tool, it doesn't match what's in the unit of competency. So for example, your unit of competency might say something like, implement a marketing plan. And when we have a look at the assessment tools, they don't implement marketing plans. They might tell you what a marketing plan is. They might tell you the parts of a marketing plan. They might tell you the kind of process that they might go through if they were to implement a marketing plan, but they never do it. So that demonstration of the application of knowledge and skill is missing. So those words that sit in the unit of competency, the doing words or the verbs, are really important words. And in fact, in unpacking the units of competency, I often go through and highlight all of them myself. And I have a look at it and say, this is the kind of thing that this unit wants me to do, therefore I have to make sure that that is what is reflected in the assessment tool that I design in the long run. You also have a situation now where, of course, instead of having one document, a unit of competency, you have two. That's easier. Come on. So we have one unit of competency that still has our elements and performance criteria in it, and it's got some information about foundation skills in it. And then we have another document, the assessment requirements document, which tells us all of the knowledge evidence that we have to collect, the performance evidence that we have to collect, and it also tells us about any assessment conditions that might apply. And we need to look at the two of those documents together. Now, in a perfect world, those two documents would match nicely. But we don't live in a perfect world. And you're going to find when you look at your units and you look closely that sometimes there's going to be some anomalies between those documents. So you'll have a look at the elements and performance criteria, then when you have a look at the knowledge evidence, you'll go, oh, that's missing. So when you go through this process of unpacking, you have to make sure that you look at both of those documents. Personally, I map my knowledge evidence and my performance evidence back onto my elements and performance criteria, so I make sure I identify any gaps in the document itself or in the documents themselves. It's a very useful process to go through, and it doesn't take very long. It's also an opportunity when you're doing that to think about whether, as a group of assessors, so for example, if all of us were assessing against the same unit, whether we would make the same interpretation of what those terms actually meant in the units of competency. So doing that as a group type process is very, very useful. You can have that discussion, and of course that's the start of what we might call some of the processes that you put in place for reliability, which is one of the principles of assessment. So when we're designing our assessment tools, we're looking at addressing both documents that we now deal with. We're looking at putting the instruments together, which are the actual tasks that somebody might perform, and we're looking at putting some good instructions in place for the people who are going to use it. So again, you also need to think about your context and think about, is this something you're going to provide to somebody in a workplace to do for you? Or is this something that your own assessors are going to do? So you might actually do something a little bit differently for both of those people. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was assessment methods, and this is on page 18 of the book. This may come as a surprise, but there are more assessment methods than written test and observation. And here's a little table to help you think about things a little bit differently. So we do in our sector have this real affinity for giving people knowledge-based tests and observation checklists. I see observation checklists all the time that have things in them that are unobservable. Okay? An observation checklist is not a cut and paste of the performance criteria from the unit of competency. And we're all laughing. I see those things every day. Hence my need for a glass of wine at the end of the day. But the reality is there are a lot of assessment methods that you can use, and your assessment methods really rely on the needs of that client group. So for example, you might have to collect some knowledge evidence. Now you might be working in a situation where in fact you're doing institutional based delivery, and you might have 30 people sitting in front of you, in which case the most logical and pragmatic way to do that might be to put some kind of written test in place for those people. You might also be dealing with trainees where you're going one-on-one out into the workplace with them, in which case the most logical method that you might use to collect the same knowledge evidence might be an interview or discussion. So you really have to make sure that the methods that you choose are suitable for the client groups that you are working with. Now within this book you've also got a number of examples about how you might choose methods based on the needs of the client groups, as well as how you might actually identify the evidence that is needed. Anybody got any questions about assessment tools? Jeff just mentioned that in the example from Holyoke we've still got employability skills in there, and that is the case because there are still training packages where they're in the old format and you will deal with employability skills. In the new training package format you'll have foundation skills, which is a combination of a couple of different frameworks. So employability skills in our old training package model sat at qualification level. Okay, so that's gone. Foundation skills are now listed in the units at unit level. Yeah. So this is one of these things that as we go and implement these things, that they're going to change, the information there will change.
And then they're quite different in each package they're dealt with.
That is exactly right, Viv. In the different training packages, they've taken quite different approaches to how they have dealt with foundation skills. Some training packages use a statement that you would be very familiar with. You would have seen in the units, they used to have a statement that said, this unit contains employability skills. How long is a piece of string? Yes. So some of the training packages that you'll deal with now, they actually use that same type of statement when they're talking about foundation skills, and they'll just say the foundation skills are explicit in the performance criteria. Yes. Other training packages have actually taken quite a different approach, and they've said these are the foundation skills that are really important for this unit. This is how they're linked to the performance criteria, and by the way, this is what it actually might look like in practice. And so that's really useful for you as a designer of assessment tools to have that kind of information, because it makes a lot of sense when you see it like that. So we've got 3 people who've got their hands up. Sharon, you were first.
With many of the IBSA units of competency, they've embedded the foundation skills table, and they've made it quite detailed.
Yes.
So my understanding is that while they've actually identified where those foundation skills relate to performance criteria, in our mapping and in the design of our assessment tools, we still need to show how we've addressed them.
Good question. Well asked. Let's see. How do I give you a short answer? They should be a representation of what is in the elements and performance criteria. The choice of whether you include those things in your mapping is a choice for you and your organisation.
Okay.
So somehow you decide, you have to guarantee within your organisation that you've addressed the requirements of the units. If you choose to do that through that process of mapping, that is up to you. If you choose to do it in another way, that is up to you as well, as long as it works.
Okay.
Yes.
Claire, you said that observation tools can't list the elements performance criteria in order to record evidence against them. Why not?
Okay, well, you twisted my words a tiny bit, but the intent was kind of the same. So when people so in an observation, so your performance criteria might say, implement the marketing plan in accordance with organisational procedures. That's a pretty typical statement that you might see. And so then we look to observation and we say, how do we put a reliable observation in place of that? What do you actually expect to see? So as a tool that I'm using to gather evidence, that doesn't give me any information. And what I'm likely to see is a tick. So I don't know anything, I haven't given the assessor any information to actually help them make a judgment about whether I've done that correctly, which is what your observation tool is supposed to be doing.
But if you've got instructions on tasks which will be performed during that observation, and you make recordings against the elements performance criteria of what was performed,
it may work.
Why can't you do it that way?
Well, it might work, but it might not too. And in my experience, the majority of the time, that doesn't work. Yes.
My question is just in relation to the list of assessment methods that you've got here on page 18 and 19. Just wanted to get your spin on that whole third-party feedback as a method of assessment, because quite often we've been told specifically and explicitly by auditors that third-party feedback is supplementary evidence, it is not a method of assessment.
Well, it is a method of collecting evidence. It's a method of collecting evidence. It absolutely is. Does it have, I guess, maybe the same strength that some other evidence might have? Often not. And it's often about that setup that we were just talking about what you're expecting to look at. And I'm sure if you think about something simple like communicating effectively, you would have worked for a number of bosses over the years who, if you think about communication methods, they will think very, very differently about that. So you might have someone who's a real stickler, someone who's quite laissez-faire about how they do things. So when we go out to third-party evidence without really good setup around that evidence and around what the expectations are for that benchmark, it tends to be weaker in terms of validity and reliability than other types of evidence. But it's certainly a methodology that can be used to collect evidence. And in higher level qualifications, it's often one that you really need to use because you can't be there all the time to see the things that you need to see, and there needs to be some reliance on a third party. But you have to set it up properly.
Probably follows on from that question, Claire. This is from the guys up at Karratha from North Regional TAFE. There's still a lot of confusion around the use of third-party reports in assessment. Please clarify, can a workplace third-party report be accepted as evidence of skills, or must any evidence of competency be collected by trained assessors, full TAE or assessor skill set?
Okay. This is one of my retirement questions, by the way. So they're the ones that I get asked so many times that if I had $1 for each time I got asked it, I'd be sipping cocktails in Tahiti. And why aren't I? The jar's at the door on the way out. So, third-party evidence. Our regulatory standards put some requirements around who can make decisions about whether someone has done something properly. Okay? So, how you use that evidence that comes back from that third party is very much about what you're asking them to do. So if all you are asking them to do is to verify, for example, let's say Claire wrote the book. Yes, Claire wrote the book. well, I'm not really that interested in what their qualifications are or their experience. As soon as you start then saying they're going to make some kind of comment or judgment about whether Claire wrote it properly, whether she followed procedures, then I become much more interested in that person's experience and qualifications. If we get to a point where we're truly relying on that person to make a judgment to say they're competent, then absolutely they will have the same qualifications as the trainers and assessors in your organisation. So it very much depends on what you're asking those people to do. So in some organisations you will have people out in the workplaces who do hold TAE qualifications and who can function as a pseudo-assessor for your organisation. In other circumstances that's not going to be the case, and you're going to need to figure out how you use information that comes from them, and how you're going to link them with the assessors in your organisation so that you can actually make a valid judgment about whether someone is competent or not. Viv's comment was, if that person in the workplace does have a certificate for and we're using them and relying on them to make judgments for us, do we keep all of the things that we do for our own assessors internal to our organisation, so things about currency, things about PD, for that third party person? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because we're all moving into the online space and we're getting people to do assessments online,
yes.
How we manage the authenticity
yes.
element of
yes.
that.
Good question. Good question. Authenticity in whether it be online or whether it be more traditional distance-based learning methodologies has always been an issue, and you are going to have some strategy for needing to do that. There are often a combination of assessment methods that might be done. So for example, someone might maybe put together a portfolio for you, and you might have a look at that portfolio and then conduct an interview with them. So there's some way of verifying that it was in fact their work. So typically there's some kind of combination of assessment methods used in those circumstances. We need to talk about clustering. So clustering, for those of us who use the word in a different way, so all the Navy people that are in the room who use that term in a different way, clustering, as we're talking about clustering, is about how we might actually group units of competency together for delivery and assessment purposes. Now, when you're looking at how you might design your assessment tools and you're unpacking the units of competency, what you'll do is you'll actually end up with a list of evidence. And when you have a look at that list of evidence, often, as you've done it for each unit, you'll notice that, in fact, as you go unit to unit to unit, there's some real commonality in either what you need to teach someone for them to be able to demonstrate competence, or in the evidence that you might need to collect to make a judgment about competence. And those circumstances are the circumstances in which we would typically say it then makes sense for us to cluster those units of competency together. There are also circumstances where units fit together and make a logical sequence of units to form a job outcome, in which case, again, it makes sense to cluster those things together because that's how the job happens. So when we're talking about clustering, they're the kinds of decisions that we are wanting to make. Now, in the publication, on page 44, there's a little checklist there for the things that you might like to consider when you are thinking about whether you would cluster units of competency together or not. And there's going to be plenty of times when you choose not to for a whole range of very valid reasons. So what they do is they say, have a look at what is actually in the unit of competency itself. Does it make sense content-wise that we might put these things together? You need to think about the characteristics of the learner, and does it actually make sense for the learner for you to group these things together? So sometimes people aren't wanting whole qualifications or whole skill sets, they just want a unit. So if that's what they want, why would you cluster with other things. They might already have, you might be in a situation where people often come to you and they already have some other units of competency. So it makes it harder for those people in those circumstances. So you need to think about who these people are that are coming to you and whether it makes sense for them. Again, there's some rules in some of the training packages about what you do put together, what you don't put together, the kinds of units you put units together with. So you have to have a look at what your training package says about your ability to cluster or not. Whether you've actually got staff who are vocationally competent in a cluster, because sometimes you will have staff who are specialists in particular units, and then how do you manage that when you're putting a cluster together? And is it able to be timetabled well within your organisation? So if you're working on a learning and assessment pathway, if you're looking at funding models, there's all kinds of things that might help you decide one way or the other whether you're going to put these units together. And then you also need to think about the workplace. So this checklist is quite useful for you in terms of a quick quality check, if you like, to say yes or no as to whether this is a good option for us in terms of clustering. Now, there are clustering examples in here as well. They sit on page 45 and 46. So in this one, we actually picked some units out of the business services training package, and we actually picked the ones on quality auditing. So next time you have an audit, whip this book out, see if they're doing the right thing. And you'll see, so what we've done is we've pulled out the knowledge evidence and performance evidence for a few units here. And when you have a look at what's in those lists, you can see there's a huge overlap. So why would you teach all of these individually when you can, in fact, cluster them together and eliminate all that repetition for the people who are your clients? That's the basis for the rest of the example in the book. So then there is examples of how you might use observation tools, how you might put practical assessments together, how you might have knowledge assessments, and I think we might even have put in some mapping in there as well. So clustering as a decision for you is exactly that. You don't have to cluster, but if you do choose to cluster, you need to think about the quality of what you're doing. Any questions about clustering? Yes. Oh, Viv.
It's about the AQF level.
Yes.
Sorry. You knew it had to.
Yeah, it had to come.
So sometimes in skill sets, for example, there might be a level 3 unit and a level 4 unit in the skill set.
Yes.
And it makes sense to cluster them together. So why is it saying no about...
It's not necessarily just saying no, but it's saying when you choose to do that, you have to think carefully about it. Because you do need to be looking at, is the evidence right for the unit? So sometimes you'll have, this is actually a good example. In there's 4 units that sit around quality auditing. One of them is what we would call a level 4 unit, the rest are diploma units. So one of the level 4 unit is participate in a quality audit, and then the other 3 are initiate, conduct and report. So there's a repetition of information that sits across those levels. One of those things you're doing under instruction, the other things you're doing as a lead auditor, although they're very similar. So what tends to happen when we cluster like that is we tend to take the higher. So we say, well, if they can lead the audit, surely they can participate in it. And so sometimes those lower level units get a little bit lost in those circumstances, and it becomes unfair for us to make a judgment about that lower level one based on evidence from the higher. It's not valid, we don't want to do that. So it's not saying you can't do it, it's just saying you have to be careful when you do. You have to think about it more closely.
So if you've got a really good evidence guide to go with each unit, and you can see where you could make a decision and say, look, you've got the 4 but you haven't got the 3.
Exactly.
Or you've got the 3 and you haven't got the 4. So
Exactly.
it's really about your evidence guide.
It is.
And that being mapped.
It is.
Okay.
And of course you will have done that in your designing assessment tools process.
Thank you.
On page 16, you've got, the sources of essential information. And one of the bullet points, the relevant Australian qualifications framework, the AQF descriptor.
Yes.
Now, my understanding is that we apply the AQF descriptor at the qualification.
Yes.
So if we are, say, for example, looking at a skill set or a cluster of units as standalone, I'm wondering whether this would still apply.
Yes. So some of the training packages have chosen to keep an indicator at unit level of what kind of qualification level that unit might contribute to. Other training packages have chosen not to. So it's a matter of having a look at the information that is in the training package and related to that skill set to say, is it relevant or not?
Okay. Thank you.
Reasonable adjustment. Now, we are in our sector incredibly reasonable people. Too reasonable, in fact. Too reasonable, in fact. So reasonable adjustment is about adjusting the processes that you are using to enable somebody to participate. It is not about adjusting the outcome level. Okay? And in our sector, that's what we most often do, both of those things. We adjust to let somebody participate, which is exactly what we should be doing, but we also adjust the outcome level. And the most common example of that relates to actually literacy and numeracy. So there will often be situations where a unit requires and explicitly requires somebody to write, and we adjust the assessment so they can do it verbally because they can't write. What we're doing is wrong in those circumstances because that's what the unit says and what it requires. So reasonable adjustment, you've got to make sure that you are looking at it with the sense of adjusting the processes or the tools or the methodologies that you are using to enable a person to participate based on their needs, but that you do not adjust the outcome level of the units. Now, this publication has got quite a lot of information in it about adjustment. From 62 onwards, there's 2 tables. So this section of the publication is focused on disability. And what these 2 tables do is they say, if you have this type of disability, then this is the type of impact that that disability has. So if we look, for example, at the first one, which is ADHD, then one of the things that can be impacted when a person has ADHD is their ability to concentrate. Yeah? When you go to the next table, so if you go to page 65, you'll see concentration sits at the top of that table. And it's saying that if you have a person who has a problem with concentration, then these are the ways that you might actually be able to adjust the assessment to help that person. So the 2 tables work together and provide you with a lot of useful information about how we can adjust things to suit the needs of individuals. So this is one tool to do that. There is also and there's a link to this tool in here. It's called the Workplace Adjustment Tool, which is a federal government tool which does exactly the same thing. It's an online database. So the important information to take from this section is you adjust to enable participation, not adjust the outcome level, and that there are in fact a lot of things that you can do to help somebody participate either in teaching and learning processes or in assessment processes. But you do need to do your research around what works or doesn't work for particular groups of people. Okay? Any questions about reasonable adjustment?
We recently had an audit, not by TAC, by the opposition.
Yes.
And they told us very clearly that all our reasonable adjustment had to be thought of beforehand and written into our strategy document. So we couldn't possibly foresee every possible adjustment we might need. What would you say?
No, you couldn't. What would I say? Okay, so remember that disclaimer. That was second slide, okay? So, there's a piece of legislation that underpins this called the Education Standards of 2005. Now, when you have a look at that piece of legislation, it says that. It says that they want you to have engaged with the person before they begin their journey to actually look at how you might address their needs. That's predicated on the assumption that they're going to self-identify to you. Now, that doesn't always happen. Our regulatory standards say you put a strategy in place that is going to suit the individual. So I understand perfectly where that came from. And you might have some standard things that you look for in your enrolment processes, that you put in your marketing information about how you're going to operate and how you might be able to adjust things to suit an individual. And that's a very proactive way of doing it. But there also has to be an element of reactivity in there. So you are going to have situations where you're going to have someone that, as you start to progress through a teaching and learning or assessment process, you realise that that person actually needs some help. And at that point of realisation, what we would want you to do is to then say, okay, this person has an issue. What are we then going to do to help them? Can we help them? And maybe sometimes the answer is no to that as well. How are we going to do this, and how are we going to monitor that it's actually effective for those people? So there's a little bit of both. Understand where the response came from, but there's an element of pragmatism too.
And this was an application for scope, so we wouldn't possibly write everything in there?
No.
So we would do that. We'd write an individual strategy for the individual student when we found out a need. Yeah.
And potentially the processes that sit behind that in your organisation would say, this is what we're going to do. Yeah, that's what we would be looking for.
Another one from Karratha, and I think they're referring to when you're talking about a student potentially with ADHD or something like that. Where should I put it? How does that fit with vocational outcomes? For example, will the task be adjusted in the workplace to cater for this student, i.e. given extra time to complete tasks?
Good question, and sometimes the answer is yes and sometimes it's no. So this is where we have, this is where that workplace adjustment tool is actually really useful, because it talks about the types of adjustments that are typically made in workplaces, and it is also where your industry consultation comes into play. So when you have that situation, why not go to industry and say, what typically happens in this circumstance? And, you know, and maybe they don't adjust. Maybe they don't. But maybe there's something in the workplace that you don't know about that's not in the books that could also be very helpful for you as well in figuring out what you could do for that person. Recognition of prior learning. This is another one of those ones that, for whatever reason, we struggle with. Recognition of prior learning is an assessment-only process. So when we are doing RPL, we are looking for the evidence that is required to make a judgment about whether somebody is competent or not. If the unit says provide 50 reports, then they provide 50 reports. Okay, so the evidence requirement is no different to any other assessment process. What is different is that maybe you don't have to generate the evidence. Maybe it already exists. Okay? So I might have been doing that in my job already, so instead of completing your assessment tool that says write 50 reports, I bring you 50 reports. By the same token, maybe there are things from my workplace that in fact I can't bring to you, and I might in fact complete your assessment tools to generate the evidence that I need for you to make a judgment. Okay, so it's not a fast way, it's not an easy way, it's just a different way of conducting assessment. And we have to get that through our heads. So, the other thing that we see with RPL processes is we see RTOs give the candidate the unit of competency and say, provide me evidence against this. Now, I think I'm a fairly reasonable person. And I can think of one situation where that might be a reasonable thing to do in an RPL situation. And that's for people who are applying for RPL against the TAE qualifications. Yes. Yeah. So, when we do that to other people, it's really quite unfair. It is our job as the RTO to say, this is the evidence that we need from you so that we can make a judgment about competence. It's not fair to give them the unit and say, you decide what you're going to give us against that. Okay? And I can see through the room there's a few people going, oh, that was so easy when we did that. But it's not fair. And you know, and it's often the reason when you think about it, I hear all the time people say, oh, it's just much easier for me to go and do the course than it is to do RPL. Now, there's something wrong when that's the statement that is being made. So, in our publication, it talks about the kinds of processes that you might put in place to implement RPL. So it talks about that tell me, show me, tell me what you know, show me what you can do type process. There's a self-assessment aspect to that. That self-assessment aspect is about saying, am I likely to be successful if I engage in this process? It's like testing the water. Once we test the water and we think, yes, this person is likely to be able to engage successfully in this process, then we move into the tell me, show me stuff. And you're still going to have your qualified trainer and assessor making a judgment about whether the evidence that's provided is, in fact, indicative of that person's competence. So again, when you think about the designing assessment tools process where we unpack the units of competency and we come up with a list of evidence that we require, here's the linkage to RPL. If you've done your design assessment tools process properly, you'll have the evidence list that you need for this process.
DTWD has an outstanding template for RPL kits. It's one of the best things they've produced. It has a disclaimer at the beginning. An RTO can use it for their own. They can't create it and sell it on to someone else, but an RTO actually, and it has the tell me section, like the questions. It actually has a case study section. It has a third party, the self-assessment. It has the documentation system, and then it has the mapping at the end. And it has all the explanations. It is so easy to use, and a lot of people aren't aware of it.
It's there, and there's links to it in the publication. Okay, our assessors, the next section in here is, and of course none of us do that. The next section in the publication is about the assessor competencies, and it refers heavily to the information that's come from the regulators around vocational competence and industry currency. As a sector, we tend to struggle a little bit with understanding vocational competence and industry currency, and in particular, understanding this deeming equivalence process. So if I don't hold the unit that I'm delivering and assessing, how does my RTO decide that I actually am competent to deliver and assess it? So the information that's in this publication will point you to the information that's come out from both the regulators, and in fact, TAC has got a great fact sheet on this process with lots of examples in it. And I know that there were some discussion, or there were some other presentations through this process as well at this forum where that was addressed. I'm assuming that you might have gone to those ones as well if that was interesting to you. Validation and evaluation is the last or second to last section of our publication. And again, it deals with those quality review, quality control processes. Now this talks about it very much in terms of the concepts that you're putting in place. So what do we do when we're looking at these things that are actually comparative processes? prior to April last year, we would have put a label of moderation on it. After April last year, we're putting a label of validation on it. It talks about how do you compare, how do you evaluate, how do you improve what you do. There's a lot of information in here about linkages to industry, the kinds of people that you might talk to, the kinds of questions that you might ask those people so that you get the right information from the right people, and of course use it in the right way. And then the last section of this is actually the useful links part of it. And this is something that really needs to be updated all of the time. The websites that both the regulators run have linkages to information. They're constantly putting out new fact sheets to help you in the sector to understand what it is that's changing and how it is that they as regulators are looking at what you do as well. So that's a really important one for you to keep up to date with, as some of those other new governing bodies actually become operational. So I'm talking about the SSOs, for example, and their websites have more than a hello, this is who we are on them. Then again, of course, you'll have information from those websites as well. And of course, DTWD also have their own website where you'll get information to help you through the very complex sector that we in fact choose to work in. So as I said, there's a lot of information in that book, and it is something that you're going to need to sit down and read and have a look at. And we hope that you find it useful, that you have some useful information in there.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.